After my mother died of cancer, my father tried to give my house to my spoiled stepsister, but I made him regret it. This has been keeping me up at night since I was 15, and it's time to speak out. I am 31 years old, and I am currently engaged in real estate development. Many people think that I am successful in my career and have a good savings. My colleagues are very envious of me. However, my life was not as smooth as others imagined. When I was 15, I was kicked out of the house by my biological father. My biological mother died of cancer when I was 4 years old. At that time, I didn't understand the meaning of life and death. I just remember that the house became extremely depressing. My father was immersed in his own world all day long, and I could only face the lack of maternal love alone. When I was 7 years old, my 42-year-old father married a woman named Beth, who is now 35 years old. At first, she behaved very well and tried to integrate into my life and play the role of loving mother. I was naive at that time and thought she would be a good stepmother. However, as time went by, I discovered that things were not as simple as they seemed. Beth's attitude began to change, and the deliberate gentleness gradually disappeared, replaced by obvious partiality and indifference. When I was a child, Beth gave birth to my half-sister, Jenny. She was always very strict with me, overly demanding, and never seemed to give me any space. I remember once, after I had managed to get a B+ on a tough chemistry test, I looked at my dad expectantly, and he just looked at me and asked, "Why not an A?" At that time, I could only bear it silently. He was always like this. I don't know why. He seemed to think that I was never good enough. But Jenny was treated completely differently. Even if she failed the exam, Beth would gently comfort her. "Dear, it's okay. You have tried your best." Beth made sure Jenny got everything she wanted, like she was a little princess, and I was the kid who never measured up like the troublemaker who was always getting in trouble. Looking back, I'm pretty sure I probably had ADD or something, but it was never officially diagnosed. I could never focus in class, and my mind was always on other things. My dad never understood any of this. He would always just yell, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" And Beth would just stand there and nod in agreement, as if I was just a problem that needed to be fixed. My father is very busy at work and often has to stay at the construction company for long hours, which leaves him with little time to pay attention to family matters. This is when Beth's true self showed up. Not only did she not care about making enough money for dinner, she even asked me to make my own sandwiches. Sometimes she deliberately put my clothes on wrongly, made them smaller or ruined, and then told Dad that I was so sloppy and always broke things. Every time I tried to explain to Dad, he would tell him that I was the one causing the trouble, because that is what Beth had made him believe. The worst part was she played mind games, stealing my stuff, and telling Dad that I was not responsible and that I was the one to blame for everything. Why did Beth lie? This was a question he could never understand. She completely fascinated him, like a light attracting moths, and I was just a bystander, watching everything happen silently. That day, her fingers gently touched his arm, and the tiny movement was like a strong wind that changed my way home and changed everything. I took my usual shortcut home, through Wilson Park. There was a slight chill in the autumn air, and the leaves were rustling, but I had no intention of appreciating it. There, by the old gazebo, I saw her, Beth, and the man standing uncomfortably close. At first, I thought they were just friends, but the moment I saw them kissing, my heart sank. It was not an ordinary kiss, nor a casual greeting, but a lingering kiss filled with secrecy and passion, like an agreement, but also like a betrayal. Beth's eyes flashed with panic, and I instinctively turned and ran away. My mind was in a mess, but I knew she saw me. I wasn't sure I recognized the man, but his face looked familiar. Then, I remembered Mark. His name was Mark. He had come over to our house, wearing a sharp suit and always looking elite, and he was a friend of Beth's running club, or at least that's what she said. Dad always trusted Beth. After all, she had spent many years creating a perfect image, and I was the troublemaker, who always caused trouble. If I told my dad, would he believe me, or would he think I was just jealous and picking on him? Thinking of this, I chose to shut my mouth and tried to bury everything I saw in my heart and let it disappear in the corner of my memory. But things are not that simple. I started noticing strange things like Jenny's hair, a unique reddish-brown color that no one else in my family had. Dad never paid attention to these details because he was always too busy, or rather, his attention was not on this at all. Late one night, I got up to drink some water and walked to the kitchen when I heard Beth on the phone. Her voice was low but anxious. I subconsciously stopped, held my breath, and listened carefully to what she said. "You don't understand. Mark, he's starting to notice." Her voice was low and a little flustered. At first, I had no idea who she was talking about until she went on to say he thought Jenny was his, but we both knew the truth. At that moment, I felt like the whole world was shaking, as if the air had been sucked out, and I stood there, my body stiff, my heart beating so fast it was about to explode. She was well aware of Jenny's relationship with my dad, not her father, but Mark. The truth of all this was so shocking that I couldn't help but gasp, but this slight noise made Beth alert instantly. Her voice suddenly stopped, and then she pretended to be calm and shouted, "Dear, it's so late. You shouldn't still be outside." I knew she was acting, and her tone was full of hypocrisy, but I didn't dare respond. I could only turn around and run back to my room. My heart was pounding, and my stomach was churning as if I was about to vomit. But now I know the truth. Jenny is not Daddy's daughter. Mark is her father, and Beth will stop at nothing to stop me from telling Daddy about this. From that day on, Beth's attitude changed completely. She began to stare at me with a vigilant look in her eyes, as if she was observing my every move, especially when she was around Jenny. She was particularly sensitive. Sometimes I would just walk past Jenny's room, and Beth would suddenly appear, stand in front of me, and ask casually, "What are you doing?" Even worse, she began making up stories about my unusual behavior around Dad, saying I was acting strange around Jenny in a way that made people question my motives. Dad was suspicious of me, and there was nothing I could do about it. I remember one time I was just helping Jenny review her multiplication tables and teaching her basic math. But Beth came in and almost forcibly pulled Jenny away, pretending that she would help. Then she turned around and told Dad that I was too close to Jenny. Her tone was sinister and faintly worried, and it still makes my stomach churn and make me feel sick. From that day on, my every move was closely monitored by her. She secretly observed me, looking for any excuse for me to make a mistake. During dinner, I noticed that the way my father looked at me had changed. That subtle sense of distrust made me feel desperate. I could only lower my head to eat and pretend that everything was normal. But that wasn't enough. Beth took the situation a step further by telling Dad that I might be on drugs or doing something bad, which made Dad even more upset with me, and that no one really cared if I was okay. Even when my grades started to slip, no one asked me what happened because Dad's attention had long been occupied with other things, and his anger was accumulating little by little and could explode at any time. A few weeks passed like this, and my situation became worse and worse. But the real disaster happened that day. After school, I walked across the park and prepared to go home as usual, but today was a little different. There was a sense of uneasiness in the air. When I got to my doorstep, I saw two police cars parked outside, lights flashing, casting an eerie silence on the entire neighborhood. My heart suddenly tightened, and my steps stopped. At this moment, I heard Beth crying, the kind of fake crying that was deliberately exaggerated, as if to gain sympathy. I pushed open the door and saw her sitting on the sofa with red and swollen eyes. She was acting very hard. Two policemen were sitting opposite her, with serious expressions. Dad stood in the corner, his face livid, his whole body exuding a furious aura, as if he would rush over and strangle someone at any time. And Jenny was nowhere to be seen. When I walked in, the conversation in the room stopped abruptly. Everyone looked at me, and one of the police stood up, walked over to me, and said, "Please come with us." I was taken into the kitchen without saying a word, while the other officer remained in the living room and continued to talk to Beth and Dad. And right there in the kitchen, they told me the news that completely devastated me. Beth and Jenny told them that I had been touching Jenny. My mind went blank in an instant, as if it had been hit hard. All the sounds faded away, and I couldn't understand what they were saying. "What?" I looked at them blankly, my lips trembling. What are you talking about? This is impossible. What did you do to her?" One of the policemen asked, his tone cold and serious. "No, I didn't do anything like this." I shook my head frantically, fear in my voice. "This didn't happen. This isn't real." But their eyes didn't waver, and they continued to torture me with those terrible questions. "Where did you touch her? How many times?" She said I threatened her to keep silent. I threatened her to keep silent, but she took action in advance, making everything irreversible. I felt like I was suffocating. The outside world was blurring, but I could clearly hear Beth fake crying in the living room. She kept saying over and over again, "I should have noticed the signs." Dad didn't say anything. He just stood there, his fists clenched, his eyes so cold that they were unfamiliar to me. He finally spoke in a low voice. "Do you want to make a statement?" "Statement? Tell the police Beth was lying? Tell them she just wanted to get rid of me because I saw her secret with Mark?" I gritted my teeth and finally decided to tell the truth. It was a big mistake. Dad's face instantly turned red, and he interrupted me with a roar. You little bastard. You're just jealous of my marriage to Beth, and you want to ruin everything. He pointed at me and yelled at me, calling me a psychopath and a liar, and every insult I could think of, while Jenny watched with fear in her eyes. The police found no real evidence. After all, nothing had happened. Besides, I was only 15, but it didn't change anything. The damage had been done. Dad threw a garbage bag at my feet and said in an uncharacteristically cold voice, You have 10 minutes, pack your things and get out. I froze and tried to tell him again about Beth and Mark, but he didn't listen. He just grabbed me by the collar and pushed me toward the stairs. I had never seen him so angry, and Beth stood there with the corners of her mouth slightly raised in a smile that only I could see. She won. I packed my things hastily, stuffed a few clothes into my backpack, and tried to take my game console with me, but my dad said coldly, Everything in this house belongs to me. Don't even think about taking anything with you. Downstairs, Beth's voice was sweet and sad, as if she was trying to comfort Jenny and at the same time assure her father that he would not change his mind. As I dragged my luggage down the stairs, Jenny stood in the living room with a confused look in her eyes, as if she didn't understand what was going on, and Beth hugged her tightly, as if to protect her from me. But what broke my heart the most was the way Jenny looked at me. She was just a child, and Beth used her as a weapon to kick me out of the house completely. Dad held out his hand. Give me the key. His tone was emotionless. You are no longer my son. Beth sighed hypocritically and pretended to be in pain. Maybe one day you will get the help you need. My blood was burning. I wanted to scream, to tear off her disguise and tell everyone the truth, but I knew no one would believe me. They watched me leave, and I finally looked back once. Dad was holding Jenny tightly, and Beth was leaning against him, continuing to fake cry, looking like a victim. The last thing I heard was my father whispering to Jenny, Don't be afraid, honey. You are safe now. I walked down the street. The night was cold and unforgiving. I had been wandering outside for hours with only $40 in my wallet and absolutely no idea where to go. I tried to go to a friend's house, but Beth had already taken action and told all the parents that I was a dangerous person, executing her plan perfectly. No one would take me in. Finally, I found an abandoned building in town where some homeless people gathered, and they let me stay for the night. I huddled in a corner, freezing cold, but what frightened me even more was my future. For the next few months, I lived what was hardly a life. No place to live, no schooling, and no real job because I was only 15. I did some shameful things to survive. Some of the food was picked up, and some was not worth mentioning. But the most painful thing was that Beth let the whole town hear her lies. I became a monster who was pointed at by others. I lost all my friends, and even the teacher who once liked me didn't want to talk to me anymore. My original life has completely disappeared. Eventually, I had to leave town. After wandering for half a year, I finally settled down in an abandoned warehouse near the train tracks, where 5 or 6 homeless people lived with me. Most of them are unlucky people who have fallen to this point because of bad luck. There was an old fellow among them, Tom, who took me under his wing. He had lost his wife, his job, and was abandoned by the world, but he was still willing to teach me survival skills, where to find food, which places allow homeless people to use the bathroom, and how to stay warm in winter. I never thought I would need this knowledge, but it became my only lifeline. At first, I naively thought that Dad would calm down, discover the truth, and come to me, but he never did. He doesn't care at all. I tried to find a job, but no one would hire me, and Beth made sure the whole town knew her story. Even McDonald's turned me down. I became the monster that everyone avoided. In the grocery store, parents would immediately pull their children away when they saw me, as if I was a monster who would hurt them. Eventually, I had to start doing jobs that were not so clean, but at least they wouldn't hurt anyone. Tom kept telling me, You have to leave this place and start over somewhere else. He is right. I have to escape from this nightmarish town, find a place where no one knows me, and start over. But I was scared, you know? I was really just a kid. Where should I go? I have nothing, and I can't even see the end of the future. A few weeks later, the police found the abandoned warehouse where we lived, saying that someone had reported the homeless people there. We were given 10 minutes to pack our things, and then we were told to leave. I had nothing to take with me, and the few belongings I had were almost all lost, and tonight, I had no place to stay. Tom took me and led me to the next town. We took a ride on a truck along the way. The driver was a kind man and was willing to take us for a while. When we stopped to eat in the evening, I counted the little change left in my pocket. Tom looked at me, sighed, and took out his last $27. I have a cousin who lives in that city who might be able to help, he said, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. His cousin owns a few restaurants, and I owe him a favor, so maybe he can find me a job. That city is about 200 miles from here, but where else can I go? Tom stuffed my cousin's address and the last $40 he had into my hands and said firmly, "You have to leave while you still can." "But what about you?" I asked. He smiled bitterly and shook his head. "I'm too old to start over." I didn't want to leave him, but he had made his decision. That was the last time I saw Tom. Occasionally, I think of him and wonder what happened to him. I boarded a Greyhound bus to that strange city and spent the first week's nights at the bus station. Finally, I found Tom's cousin Dave. He was different from what I had imagined, neat and tidy, well-dressed, and looked nothing like someone related to Tom. He managed 3 restaurants and put me in a high-end Italian restaurant washing dishes. The first few months were tough, and I had to sleep in the restaurant's storage room. Dave took pity on me and let me rest there after get off work so that at least I wouldn't end up on the streets. I saved every penny and finally rented a shabby little room. Although the environment was bad, at least it was a place of my own. At the same time, I started learning everything I could. From washing dishes to food preparation to assembly line cooking, I gradually mastered how the restaurant operated. The head chef noticed that I was a quick learner and started teaching me how to calculate food costs, manage inventory, and even dabbled in some business data. There is a regular customer in this restaurant, Amy. She comes every week with her mother and always sits in my serving area. By then, I had moved up from dishwasher to waiter. Amy was a university student studying business administration, and we would occasionally chat, especially when the restaurant was not busy. She is the first person in all these years who doesn't treat me like garbage. I remember very clearly our first formal conversation. She was flipping through the menu, but looked up and asked me, "What's good to eat in this restaurant?" She didn't just listen to me talking about the special price mechanically, but asked me seriously. I was a little surprised and paused for a moment before answering. Marco's carbonara is delicious, and the sauce is completely handmade. You even know who cooked the dish?" She laughed. "That's pretty cool." We then chatted about the food for 10 minutes. Her mother sat by and smiled, but she finally reminded him, "Amy, don't bother the poor waiter anymore. He has other guests to take care of." Amy looked around the empty restaurant and smiled mischievously. "Yeah, Mom, he's obviously got his hands full." Later, they came more and more often, and even specifically asked to sit in my area. Once, while doing homework in the restaurant, she was troubled by an accounting problem and complained, "This makes no sense. How can a company that is losing money show profits?" I glanced at the title and said casually, "Maybe they are adjusting the accounts to make the data look better and attract investors." Amy looked at me in surprise. "How do you know this?" I shrugged. "I've been reading business books to learn more about how restaurants work. Maybe one day, I'll open a restaurant of my own." Her eyes lit up when she heard this. "Oh my God, that's great. Most people wouldn't care about this. You're really smart." After that, she often brought her homework, and sometimes I would sit at her desk during break time to help her solve the problems. Her mother just looked at us with a smile and didn't say much. Gradually, we started talking more and more, and I began to be unable to resist my feelings for her. I know I shouldn't like her, but I failed. Amy is smart and funny, and every minute I spend with her makes me feel like I'm no longer the outcast. One time, she suddenly asked me, "You are so good at business knowledge. Why are you still working here?" I smiled awkwardly. "Not everyone has the money to go to college." She looked at me firmly. "College is not the only way to success. My dad didn't go to college either, but now he owns 3 companies." This sentence is deeply imprinted in my mind. Maybe I can do more than just be an employee in a restaurant. Eventually, I obtained an equivalent degree by studying on my own in the library. On my days off, Amy helped me with math. She never asked about my past, and I never brought it up. I was afraid that if she knew everything, she would leave me like everyone else. My life became extremely simple for the next 5 years. Wake up, work, study, sleep, and repeat. No dates, no real friends. Everything was just about surviving and trying to get better. But I kept thinking about Jenny, hoping Beth wouldn't destroy her as she had destroyed me. Then, one evening, Amy came in, looking incredibly excited. Guess what? My dad is looking for someone to help manage one of his new real estate developments. Her eyes sparkled. "It's an entry-level position, but there's a lot of room for growth. You should apply." I was stunned. "Amy, I didn't even graduate from high school." "But you got your GED, right?" She looked at me seriously. "That's what matters. Give it a try. What's the worst that can happen?" "Worst case scenario, is that they find out about my past. Beth's lies, the stigma that had been ingrained into me about me being a dangerous person. She fooled everyone except you, I whispered. Amy held my hand and said firmly, then let them see the real you. So I applied for the job and borrowed a suit from Dave that was a little worn but still fit me well. On the day of the interview, I sat opposite Amy's father. He looked at me for a full minute, and that look made me sweat. Then, Amy spoke up, Dad, he really understands business. Give him a chance. The interview went surprisingly well, and I talked about real estate development trends and even gave him a suggestion on one of his new projects. Finally, he nodded. You start work on Monday. When I told Amy I got the job, she hugged me excitedly. This was the first time in years that someone had truly hugged me. I almost cried. I'm telling you, you can do it, she said with a smile. That job changed everything. Amy's father became the kind of person I wanted my dad to be. He listened to my ideas and taught me everything about the real world. Within a year, I went from being an assistant to managing my own projects independently, and I had a good income. Amy and I also became closer and closer. We would go for coffee after get off work and talk for hours, but I never asked her out. Beth's lies still haunt me, and I still feel unworthy. Then the night came. We worked overtime until very late, and there were only two of us left in the office. Amy suddenly raised her head and looked me straight in the eye. You are so smart in business, but some things are so stupid. What do you mean? I asked, puzzled. I've been waiting for you for 2 years. Why don't you ask me out? I was stunned. Amy, I lowered my head. I'm not good enough. You don't know my past. Then tell me, she said seriously. So I told her everything. Beth's lies, my homelessness, all the injustice and pain. I waited for her reaction, for a look of disgust, for her to step back in fear. But she cried. Not because of me, but because of Beth and Dad. How could they do this to their own son? She glared at the air, her eyes full of anger. Then she reached out and grabbed me by the collar, pulled me towards her, and kissed me. That's it. Amy and I were finally together. But life always brings the past back to reality when you least expect it. Amy and I were married soon after. Her family accepted me and truly treated me as one of their own. And we had our first child, a boy. We bought a 5-bedroom house, and everything was perfect. Until 3 months ago. The other day, I was scrolling through Facebook at work, and a friend request popped up. It's my dad. His profile picture made me freeze in place. He looked much older than I remembered, but I still recognized his face at first glance. I stared at my phone like a fool, not knowing what to do. Amy noticed something was wrong with me. When I got home, I sat in the kitchen, looking dazed. She held our son in her arms and gently asked, What's wrong? It's my dad, I whispered. He added me as a friend on Facebook. She put the child down and sat next to me. What are you going to do? I have no idea. He also sent a message. I hesitated and handed her the phone. She opened it and read, Son, I know it's been a long time. I'm old, and I think a lot about the past. I didn't do a good job as a father. Beth, and I wanted to make amends. Jenny misses her brother. Please give us a chance to explain everything. Love your dad. I laughed, but not a happy laugh. Jenny, does she really miss me? She was only 8 years old at the time. 16 years had passed. Did she even remember me? Amy squeezed my hand tightly. You don't have to respond. But I still went back. Maybe I'm a fool, but I wonder. Why now? Why, after 16 years? Did he remember me? I accepted the friend request and sent a message. Why now? His reply came quickly. I am 58 years old now. The health scare made me realize that life is always full of unforeseen twists and turns, and Jenny's resentment seemed to be a microcosm of all the efforts I had ever made. Getting married is one of the most important decisions I have ever made. It means a lot and makes me re-examine my past life and choices. A few weeks later, I learned that Jenny was now 24 and working in marketing, while Beth was still the same, not much different from what I remembered. Dad kept telling me that Beth was only living for herself and that I shouldn't let her influence my decisions anymore. Amy also advised me to be careful and not let the past determine the future. I wanted to believe that my father had become more rational, but I still felt uneasy. However, I decided to meet them, and this time, I made my own choice. Dad and Beth showed up at my house on Saturday morning. Dad looked much older and walked with a limp. Beth was still the same, with that fake smile. Jenny has grown up and looks more and more like Mark. The atmosphere was awkward, and no one knew what to say. Then Jenny saw the family picture on our wall and asked, Is this your son? She asked, looking at me, staring at the picture of our 3-year-old. I nodded and said, "That's Jack. I'm the aunt." Beth whispered, suddenly starting to cry, and immediately went to comfort her. Dad walked into my house as if he was the owner. He looked around and saw almost everything hidden at a glance. He had never given me any recognition, not even this time. "You've done a great job." He nodded and said, "Real estate development never fails." I folded my arms, ready for this visit. Then Dad popped the question. "Have you ever thought about giving the house to Jenny?" I was stunned for a moment. I couldn't believe my ears. "Are you serious?" I asked, almost pointedly. Dad's tone was a little tough. "This is your sister. You should leave the house to her." I stood there, my heart filled with anger. "What did you want? You chose her over me?" It was sharper than I had intended, and I knew I was losing control in my anger, but I didn't care. "You kicked me out of the house. That was 15 years ago," I said coldly, without a trace of warmth in my eyes. My father didn't respond, but sent me a photo of his daily life and spoke in a sighing tone, sounding helpless. He looked a little tired in the photo. I seemed to want to say something, but I kept it to myself. Putting the phone down, I turned around and headed for the door, my mind full of questions. Why did he never stand on my side? I lived on the street and was filled with rage, wondering why he would dare to do such a thing. He looked mad, as if I had put off something that was inconvenient for him. In the past, Jenny needed my voice. She needed me to step up and be her support. My hands clenched in a fist, and I felt like I was about to explode. Maybe what Jenny really needs is a father who earns everything for her, and I may need a father who believes in me. Before he could speak, Beth hurried over, pretending to be worried. The expression on her face looked hypocritical, as if she was making excuses for herself. "Well, I don't want to say anything more." I let out a high-pitched, lifeless laugh. "Oh yeah, Beth, everything is fine." I turned to her, smiling enough to cut off Dad's hopes. "Why would I give my house to your daughter? Do you know?" The room fell silent for a moment. Beth's face turned pale, almost frozen, and Jenny looked confused, as if wondering what I meant. The whole situation seemed to have changed suddenly, and everything began to take new directions. I walked out of the office and went to find Amy and Jack. Jack was in the backyard playing with his toy trucks, and Amy looked at me and realized what was happening. She took Jack inside, leaving the others inside to process what I had said. Beth tried to take control of the situation, telling Dad that I was just trying to cause trouble and ruin their lives. But this time, Dad didn't look like he believed Beth. He requested a DNA test, and Jenny's identity was revealed at this moment. When the test results came out, Dad didn't wait too long. When he got home, he sat down directly, without saying a word, and just cried quietly. The DNA test results showed that Dad was not Jenny's father. He had always thought his life was in order, but it all suddenly collapsed. I should have been content, even happy with the truth, but seeing my dad cry made me feel empty inside. This man who once frightened me now looked like a broken child. He asked me about Mark, and I told him everything I knew, that Mark used to roam the streets, getting into trouble. I don't know where he is now, or even if he is still alive. My father seemed to be 2 years older, looking at me with confusion and pain in his eyes. "I don't care," I told him. "This is not my problem anymore." The next day, Amy called me and told me that my dad had come home and had a breakdown. Beth tried to cover it up as usual, telling Dad that the test must be wrong and the lab made a mistake. But this was the first time that Dad no longer believed her lies. All of the manipulation and lies suddenly came crashing down, and Dad stood in the room and yelled, "I hurt her." Jenny is now in hospital, and doctors say she has 3 vertebrae fractures and may need pain medication all the time. The dad called the police and was eventually arrested. They requested a sentence of 3 to 5 years, but because of his good past record and his age, the court may give him a reduced sentence. But Beth's family is fighting hard to get him to serve his full sentence, and Jenny's entire world comes crashing down overnight. Her respectable lawyer fiancé did not want to inherit the disaster brought to her family, so he broke up with her directly. Now, Jenny keeps calling and texting me, begging me to help her find her biological father. Amy advised me to stop caring about these things and just get them out of our lives. She may be right, but I still can't be completely cruel. At least for Jenny, she didn't choose her birth. Everything she had believed since she was a child suddenly became a lie. I heard today that Beth had become addicted to painkillers and her family had to put her in rehab. Jenny now lives with her aunt and refuses to contact her father or Beth. This perfect family has completely disappeared. But the strangest thing was that I didn't feel the relief I thought I would. I thought all this would make me feel like justice had finally been served, but it wasn't. It's more like watching a house on fire, where the contents can no longer be saved and eventually just turn to ashes. But right now, I just want to focus on my family. Amy was pregnant, this time with a girl, and the extra bedroom in our house finally came in handy. Life is like this, it never goes the way anyone expects. 2 months later, Dad's trial turned out to be more complicated than expected. My lawyer advised me not to go to the trial, and I really didn't want to see them again. In the end, Jenny told me Dad was sentenced to 3 years. It could have been more severe, but the judge took his age and clean record into consideration and decided to reduce the sentence. He is 58 now, and in 3 years, he will still be a free man. Beth is still in rehab and has reportedly been dependent on pain medication for even longer than we knew. Her sister told Jenny that Beth had been abusing drugs for years, but she had covered it up well. It all made sense now, why she was always so paranoid, always telling lies, always eager to control everything. Jenny also received psychological treatment for several months, but her condition was not very good. Later, she began to look for Mark on her own, asking around for news about him at homeless shelters. Eventually, she found someone who knew him, who told her that Mark had died of a drug overdose 2 years earlier, lying behind a convenience store. Jenny collapsed. She started sending me long messages late at night, pouring out her pain at 3 in the morning. She said her whole life had been a lie, and she couldn't even look in the mirror because all she saw was Mark's face. I did feel bad for her, but Amy reminded me that I had to keep my distance. She was right. Every time, once I responded to Jenny, she would become more and more dependent on me and ask me more and more questions about the past. The most ridiculous thing is that Jenny's ex-fiancé also tried to contact me and asked, "Does mental illness run in your family?" He said he wondered if there would be problems if he had a child with Jenny. I just told him to get lost. Jenny has definitely been through a lot, but she doesn't deserve to be treated this way. However, even though the DNA test proved everything, Beth was still spreading lies, telling everyone that I made it all up, even saying that I faked Mark's death to get even with her. What's speechless is that some old neighbors actually believed her lies, as if they just liked this kind of dramatic story. But I don't care anymore. Amy's pregnancy is going well, and we are looking forward to the birth of this girl. Sometimes, watching Jack playing with his toy car on the ground, I would think of Jenny when she was a child. If Dad had really noticed the signs, if I had told people what I saw in the park sooner, would the outcome have been different? But you can't change the past. The feeling now is very different. After they left, the negative energy in this house has finally disappeared. We decided to turn the room that Dad had wanted to give to Jenny into a baby room. Amy had planned everything, a pink and gray theme with little stars on the ceiling. Sometimes I still think of Tom. If it weren't for him, I might not have survived that period. I wish I could tell him that I succeeded, that I really did it like he said. Hope he is doing well wherever he is. As for the news about the father, I heard that some people in the family supported him, some hated him, but no one cared about how he let his son wander the streets all these years. Family is such a strange thing sometimes. At this point, I'm not sure what the future holds. But life must go on. To everyone who has followed this story and supported me, thank you. It was harder than I thought it would be, but writing this down really helped me. Special thanks to those who suggested I go to therapy. You were right. The last time Jenny contacted me was yesterday. She told me she was moving out of state to start a new life and asked if we could stay in touch. Amy came in with a cup of tea in her hand and gently placed it in front of me. She knew what I was thinking, but she didn't say anything, just sat down and leaned on me. Her presence made me feel at ease. Do you think she can really start over? I asked in a low voice. Jenny, Amy sighed softly. If she really wants to, she can. I nodded, but I knew in my heart that it was not easy for a child who grew up in lies to rebuild himself. I was once like that too. A few days later, I received one last text from Jenny. Thank you for trying to help me. I will try to forget the past and create a new life. I didn't reply, but I hope she does. Soon after, I stood in the hospital, holding my daughter in my arms, watching her sleeping peacefully, Amy smiling tiredly but happily. She's so small, I whispered. She'll grow up. Amy stroked her face gently, just like Jack. I looked at my children and finally felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction. The shadows of the past no longer haunted me, and I finally had my own family. At this time, Jenny sent me a message. She said she wanted to come and see my child and asked if I agreed. I told her, maybe one day, but not now. Now I need to focus on my family. I want to greet a good life with a good mood. At least now, I don't want to think about the past. My life is my own, and I define it.